Hello and welcome to the Cambridge Festival. This is a really important discussion that goes to the heart of our rather slow response to the immense climate emergency. My name is Steve Evans. I lead a research centre that looks at industrial sustainability here in Cambridge, and we study how industry can deliver sustainability at scale and speed. So what I study is a very narrow professional system and its relationship with climate change. Happily, our panel draws on a much wider set of experiences, and we'll have a fantastic debate today. We've got four fantastic panelists. I want to just briefly explain who they're going to be, and then we'll kick off into the conversation. First, we're going to be listening to Fred Pearce, an author and a journalist on the environment, reporting from 89 countries. And since 1992, he's been the environment consultant at New Scientist, writes regularly for The Guardian and occasionally for the Washington Post and the New York Times, and weighs down some of my shelves, Fred. So I will be asking you for a discount very soon. Secondly, we're going to be hearing from Kamya Mohades, a macroeconomist from Judge Business School here in Cambridge again, and advisor, amongst others, to the International Monetary Fund, parts of the United Nations, and the Asian Development Bank. So please welcome Kamya. We're going to get a third and different view from Rob Doubleday, who's the executive director of the Centre for Science and Policy at Cambridge. And Rob's research interests, happily, are on the role of science, evidence, and expertise in contemporary society. There can be no bigger topic, not that we're having a COVID conversation. He brings degrees in chemistry, science and technology, policy, and geography to bear on the challenge. So again, how wide can we be? Well, we can be wider still. And very happily, we're going to finish by hearing from Zoe Svensson, who lectures on dramaturgy and performance at Cambridge and is director of the performance arts company Metis. Her works have focused on imagining economic transformations for livable futures under the conditions of climate change. And she's collaborated with the Old Vic, the National Theatre, the Royal Shakespeare Company, amongst others. How fantastic a group. And we're going to start with a very good argument from Fred Pearce.
Thanks, Steve. You asked, why has it taken so long for us to take climate change seriously? Well, I want to be perverse for a moment. I go back a long way, I'm afraid, as a political observer and an activist, as well as a journalist. I hate to say this, but I was first writing about climate change for New Scientist magazine back in the 1980s. And back then, nobody much had heard of it. Greenpeace, I was reliably told then, had decided not to campaign on the issue because it wasn't convinced that it was important. It's hard to kind of believe, but that's the case. If there was going to be an apocalypse, most of us thought it was going to be nuclear war or perhaps a nuclear winter. So from that perspective, I'm actually quite impressed with the progress that's been made. Climate change is on everybody's agenda, even though it could easily have been crowded out by more immediate concerns. So Joe Biden has declared three priorities, two of them very urgent: the pandemic and the US economy, and the third one, fighting climate catastrophe in the future. Even Boris Johnson is bigging it up these days. More to the point, perhaps, the world is developing much cheaper and then actively deploying the necessary technology to unplug our world from its carbon addiction. Not fast enough, for sure, but it is happening. And this is a fundamental reboot of our economic and industrial systems. So perhaps it's not surprising it's taking time. Back in the 1980s, as I struggled to persuade editors to devote space to the topic, I certainly wouldn't have guessed we'd have come so far so soon. And given our dysfunctional world, how dysfunctional it often appears anyway, and the fact that for most of us, most of the time, climate change is still a scary thing in the future somewhere, I can't help actually being slightly impressed at how far we've got. But that's a somewhat cynical political perspective, perhaps. Of course, as a climate observer, I'm much more frightened. It has taken so long since we became aware of the issues seriously, and the climate won't wait for the politics. We may be pushing the world close to tipping points beyond which a return to the old climate stability will be impossible, whatever we do after that. So the stakes are really, really high. But if I have some optimism, it's because I begin to think that just as there are tipping points in the climate system that can push us to climate chaos, so too there are tipping points in human systems. Tipping points that are rapidly making it unacceptable and even uneconomic to burn coal in power stations today. And soon, I hope, we'll be making burning petrol in a car as taboo as smoking a cigarette in a public hall, something else I wouldn't have guessed at when I worked in smoke-filled offices back in the day. So you asked the question, let me suggest what is happening. You may find it depressing or gratifying according to your political taste, but businesses are finding they can make money out of fixing climate change. That's why action is now happening. So from Danish wind turbine designers to Elon Musk becoming the world's richest person on the back of promising electric cars, capitalism has got cute about climate change and it's planning on making a profit out of saving the world. Now, I'm an old socialist at heart, so I don't enjoy saying this, but I think it's true. And I'm certainly not saying that capitalism can fix everything, so we don't need to worry. Even if we get to net zero in a couple of decades, thanks to new technology, it may be too late to stop the catastrophe. We can't say that for sure. We don't know, quite simply. So I don't know whether our tipping points will come in time to stop the world passing the climate's tipping points. But in answer to the question, why has it taken so long for us to take climate change seriously? I think the simple and perhaps obvious answer is that it took that long for the masters of our universe to figure out how to make a profit out of it. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Fred. I think that you've definitely started a few balls rolling. Certainly in my head, I'm busy writing away notes, and I'm sure everybody else is in reaction to that. And I hope later on in a conversation, we can extract some further wisdom from you. Now, I'd like to move on to Kamya Mahrez. As I said, an economist. We're going to be nice to you, even with that label. We've just been really nice to capitalists in general. So please bring us your insight, Kamya.
Thank you very much, Steve. So I'm gonna take a different approach. I want to just, as economists, obviously, we've been interested in the issues of climate change for, I think, intensely over the last decade or so. And we are trying to answer some important questions to inform policy and therefore kind of exacerbate action. And one of the things that economists are trying to answer is how large are the effects of climate change on economic activity? Does climate change have short-term or long-term growth effects? Obviously, if there is long-term growth effects, the costs of climate change are substantially larger than potentially discussed currently. And are the effects larger for poor or hot countries, or are they asymmetric? What about the rich and cold countries? And also, I suppose more importantly, what are the channels of impact and which sectors are affected the most? So prevailing economic research actually suggests that climate change is only really an issue from an economic point of view for hot or poor nations. And in fact, some predict that cooler or wealthier economies will be unaffected or even see some benefits from higher temperatures. So a recent study in Nature, I believe it was in 2015, just before the Paris Agreement, in fact suggested that Finland would be 5 times larger, Russia 4 times larger, and Mongolia 14 times larger by year 2100 in a no mitigation scenario. So this is a RCP 8.5 scenario. And this could perhaps be one reason why it's taken so long for climate change to be taken seriously by policymakers in some countries. In particular, because obviously the costs of climate change are, you don't observe them short term, and policymakers sometimes and people in government are more concerned with election, but also because if the costs are estimated to be positive, why take action immediately? So that could be one reason. I want to say in our recent study, actually, we showed that all countries, whether you're rich or poor or hot or cold, you will suffer economically by year 2100 if the current trajectory of carbon emissions is maintained. In fact, we showed that rich and colder countries are going to lose as much in terms of per capita income to climate change as poorer and hotter nations. To give you an example, in the case of the United States, we observed that U.S. income per capita will be lost by about 10.5% in the best case scenario by year 2100, which is a substantial economic hit to people's disposable income. So, and obviously, this is an important fact. Secondly, often people think that this effect of climate change is through the agricultural sector. And actually, what we show is that all sectors in the economy, and we look at the US in particular, we look at US states, we show that all sectors are affected. It's from manufacturing to retail, to insurance, to wholesale, etc. All sectors of the economy will be affected by climate change. And I think this is something that economists generally show is happening in the agricultural sector, and also not in advanced economies, but in developing countries. So I think this is one reason why we haven't really taken this cost of climate change very seriously in perhaps advanced economies. The other thing is, this is not just about carbon addiction, right? This is not just about the fact that we need to reduce our emissions and we need to reduce our oil and gas consumption, move towards renewable energy. It's also about changing our lifestyles in advanced economies. So if you look at the amount of food that's wasted in Europe, in the value chain, it's about 31%, I think it was estimated. If you look at the percentage of edible mass of fruit and vegetable which is lost, it's about 46%. If you look at percentage of cars that are parked and not used at one time, it's about 90%. I mean, the way we are living as well is not quite sustainable. And I will suggest that the focus on purely cutting, our gas and oil consumption, which some policymakers are focusing on, is perhaps not the right way. We need to have a more holistic view. And there comes the circular economy concept, that we need to think about the economy being circular as opposed to a linear process that we are thinking about. So those are some of my thoughts. And I want to finish up with the last one, which is, I mean, even though we recognize that climate change is costly, the global economy has been hit by two major economic shocks in the last 12 years. One of them was the global financial crisis, which was really a crisis in advanced economies, not in emerging economies, which set back, I think, the climate change agenda. And the second one is obviously the COVID shock that we're living through, which again sets back the climate change. Although climate change is in everybody's, everybody wants to talk about climate change. People are talking about a green recovery. Actually, what people are doing currently is investing in rescuing the economies, not thinking about how to, spend this money in a green way. It's about saving jobs and people's livelihoods. So that could be potentially another reason why recently we've been a setback in this. I'll stop there.
It's a very timely intervention on the fact that we're investing to rescue rather than taking and grabbing the opportunity and surfing the moment to build something that might be better. And I hate to grab a political phrase in that sense and be pulled back into that. Now, if we can take this forward, I'm going to introduce Rob Doubleday, a reminder that his enthusiasm is for science, evidence, and expertise, a rare and wonderful thing. Rob, what does that tell us?
Well, I think that is the starting point I'd like to begin with, which is thinking about how science and universities have played into the questions of climate change over the last 3 decades. And I think one can see that there has been a major contribution from science in framing and understanding the issue in the early days, in then making, building up the picture, the evidence, building the models that have helped understand the relationship between human activity and climate change through models of the atmosphere, models of global climate. And of course, as Fred and Camilla pointed to, the progress that we have seen is partly because of technological innovation that has made certain things possible in terms of energy production and use. And so, it's certainly possible to take one view that looks quite optimistic and positive about, the road we've been on. And thinking about the United Kingdom, again, one can tell a more optimistic story about the passing of the Climate Change Act in 2004, committing to taking on, legal responsibility to deliver now net zero by 2050. And there's, a series of carbon budgets that set out a plan to get to that point. And that has, quite widespread political support at the moment among major political parties in this country, and which, almost everybody who voted in the last general election voted for these kinds of dramatic changes over the next few decades. And, looking at it more deeply through the Climate Change Commission in the UK last year, that reported in September last year, as representative members of the public in this country look more deeply at the kinds of choices that will be needed to make hard choices, change in behavior, people are supportive. So that's quite a good story, one can tell. People, I do observe that, building on the points that Fred and Camille have made, people expect the hard choices are yet to come, because the kinds of changes that are needed now are going to be about how we live our life. It's not going to be possible to make further progress through continued sort of technical fixes behind the scenes in terms of where our energy comes from. So thinking about, how we move, how we heat our homes, how we cook. And I think that that's where really some difficult challenges lie ahead in how we even think about the kinds of changes that are needed. And that's perhaps where universities are going to have to come in with a different kind of contribution, which is helping conceptualize the kind of systemic changes that may be needed. So if you're thinking about, the kinds of ways, as I said, that we heat our home, what kinds of changes does that mean for the infrastructure in our towns and cities, the way we cook, the way we think about heat? These are big systemic changes that may be needed. And as Camille said, at a time when it doesn't make sense for a sort of whack-a-mole approach where we just focus on climate change, this year, and then we'll worry about jobs next year, and then we'll worry about biodiversity the following year. There needs to be a much more holistic approach. And that's where Cambridge Zero, which is the University of Cambridge's effort to try and bring all aspects of the university together to focus on these kind of questions, is going to be making a difference. So Cambridge Zero is only a year old, but it tries to combine research across all disciplines with the university's education across all disciplines, and again, all spheres, and its engagement with the world and its own carbon footprint, and trying to think holistically about ways forward.
Thank you, Rob. I think that I'm a member of the Cambridge Zero initiative, and part of the excitement for me is interacting with people who can bring other sets of knowledge to bear. And you realize that you can make 2 and 2 add up to something substantive, whether that be 4 or 5, depending on your preferred metaphor. And no better introduction for Zoe, who's going to bring a very different viewpoint and some of her skills, no doubt, in communicating on the climate emergency. Zoe.
Hello, thank you. Well, actually, I'm really delighted and heartened to hear what everyone's been saying, partly because I have often been in forums in which it feels like I'm saying something slightly different. But actually, what I am interested in, it's very much builds on this notion of a holistic approach. I think it might be going to sound slightly more anti-capitalist than perhaps is what's been heard so far. I would like to say that I am very much in favour of markets, particularly fruit and veg ones. It's something about the abstraction of money that perhaps might be in question here. That I believe in production, but not necessarily in using things up. I believe in ingenuity, in effective and efficient use of resources, but not in the corruption of the word efficient that I think has happened in over past times. And most of all, I kind of care about symbiosis. I'm often told to, I'm showing these postcards because this is part of the kind of research and kind of engagement process that we've been undertaking as part of the theatre and performance work we've been doing for some time now around these questions. But they started out as a kind of cry into the dark, a kind of shout of frustration about the sense that as theatre makers, we somehow seem to be able to have a conversation around these topics, which I've sort of been doing for about a decade now. Ever since I discovered very much as a layperson about the issue of the tipping point. It's like, why didn't I really understand that before? Like, why isn't that the critical moment? The idea that there may be a point at which we can't come back from. And things have only ever accelerated since. So, you know, when people tell me to get real and stop being utopian about imagining how we might do things otherwise, I want to tell them to get real about the world that we're actually living in, you know, the sort of end the gaslighting of the culture. So we've thought a lot about what this is, like, what are we living through? Why is this, I think, for a lot of ordinary people quite difficult. And we came up with this term high carbon culture, which isn't just a naming of in the Western world particularly, but also the global elites addiction to fossil fuels and the sort of the speed and accelerative process. It's also to do with a kind of inherent extractive, transactive mode of operation that goes obviously back to the kind of twin damage caused by colonialism and capitalism over a very long period of time. And what we've been interested in is how that relates to mindset, entirely separate perhaps from specific political views that someone might behold. But we are trained to be masters over nature, over each other, over our own lives. We're trained, I mean, as artists, we're trained to be masters of the form, right? So there's a kind of sense in which we're embedded, and this is what we wanted to try and get at, which is like, well, what is high carbon culture? Well, high carbon culture is driving to the gym to get fit. You know, it's these contradictions that we live in. It's me flying to Oslo and seeing them build a new airport wing while they're being celebrated as being Green City 2019, and I'm taking part in an architecture triennale all about degrowth, at which we run workshops with international artists who decide that the main thing that they should now do is not build anything else, that actually the practice of architecture might have a very different process moving forward. So, you know, is my feeling about this, because in neither individual action nor sort of top-down rules are going to do the trick on their own. There needs to be a kind of symbiotic relationship, and for that we all need help. So we've been thinking about the question of who are we, and who do we think we are, and who do we want to be. So the project has become kind of, to come back to dramaturgy, all about who we think we are. Are we tragic heroes who are going to go down in flames with our economic individualism, clinging to this idea of mastery and take the planet with us? Or are we on some kind of epic journey in which we don't know the outcome and the future of our impacts of our actions, that we understand that there isn't a way of kind of finding one size fits all, save the world solution, but actually there's multiple, there's a kind of and both. And this is why fundamentally I'm not anti-capitalist, because I think we need everything that we could throw at this problem. And this is where play comes in, because you know, the most unserious thing in the world is perhaps now the most important thing that we can do, which is that kind of idea of open-ended play, of imagining, of putting yourself in a situation, of working out who you might be under transformed conditions, is a playful but also rather brilliant way of getting around the kind of the sense of there is no alternative, or you know, it's so difficult, and if I do this then that will go wrong, or you know, you can think of pretty much any proposed climate solution and someone can come up with something that actually is going to be damaging to the environment in some way about it. So rather than letting that stop us, these double binds of high carbon culture, we've kind of decided that, you know, we should write the future, because you know, someone else is writing our dystopian future for us already. Perhaps we should, you know, fight back a little. So, you know, in a sense, it's pure escapism. It's a little moment of relief from the relenting troubles that are in the wider context. In another sense, we've discovered over the few years we've been doing this. So we did a sort of large-scale performance installation at the Barbican Centre in London, deep down in the bunker in the Pit Theatre. in 2018, and lots of the things we were imagining about the future of the City of London for slightly different reasons have been happening. So we very small scale things like, here's a beehive, you know, we imagine beehives all over the high rises. Recently, one of my actors walked through the City of London and noticed some beehives on some high rises. Of course, we didn't invent them, we didn't conjure them, but there's a certain feeling that perhaps we might have done. So to sort of come to a conclusion, the idea is that hope is a verb. It's not something you have, it's something you do. It's in all of those small actions, even if you don't know the full ramifications of what you might be participating in. And to finish joyfully with the words of Christiana Figueras, UN Chief Negotiator for the Paris Climate Agreement, especially given that the US is now re-signed up to it, is impossible is not a fact, it's an attitude.
Well, it's impossible not to react positively, Zoe, to that, and to all four speakers. Only half an hour ago, I thought we were going to have a bit of a doom and gloom, and I'd have to inject some play into this. And that's one of the reasons I was asked to do this. And I now feel I can sit back and let you all demonstrate your play amongst yourselves. But I do want to have a kickoff question, and I'm going to go back to the start. Fred, I'm going to be an old man myself. So I've been in this research subject as long as you've been writing about it. And when I started, the literature told us that we had 200 years to solve the problem, that climate change is something that would accumulate over a couple of centuries. And pretty much on average, in every year of my time studying this subject, the target has come forward by 5 years. So instead of studying something where my students would have to solve the final problem, I now find that I have to. And it's a race between tipping points. And I really liked your idea of a sort of human tipping point. Now, if it's a race, if the human tipping point has got to beat the climate tipping point, and I'm going to start with you, Fred, what do we have to do to create the Usain Bolt of human systems?
I think two things are going to happen, Steve. We need technical fixes. I mean, I know I'm a science journalist, so I'm a little, I've written about this stuff a fair amount, but I am impressed with the extent to which technical fixes are driving what we're doing. It's not just, the fact that wind turbines and solar panels are now, a 50th of the price that they were a few years ago. Which just transforms the economics. So we can talk about the economics, but it's the technology that often drives that. Technical fixes matter. And as has been said all along, we also need to change our social norms. We need to, and those will happen in kind of subtle ways. I mean, most people aren't sort of vanguardists going out there fighting the climate change. Most people, most of the time, are just doing what everybody else does. So we need to change social norms. But I think that's happening. And that's why I love Zoe's presentation, because one of the things, if I'm really trying to irritate scientists, I tell them, scientists, keep out of the climate change discussion, because we know enough about the science of climate change. We don't need to know any more. It's useful to have a bit more, but we really don't need it. What we need is societal change, which comes through architects and lawyers and artists and filmmakers and novelists and every damn body thinking of integrating the sort of notion about climate change in a finite planet and these things into their daily lives and how they think and how they express themselves and so on. So we need both technical fixes and we need social norms. Probably, we've talked a bit about economics, probably economics is the thing we need least. That's the sort of flywheel, the motor or something in the system, but I think it's the big stuff. It's the transformative things, the things that will transform the economics and the way that we think about the costs of things that is really going to matter. Yeah, I'm with Zoe. Let's expand the conversation as much as we can, use as many different languages, as many different ways of thinking about this as we can. That's how we'll get to our tipping point before the climate does for us all.
Thank you, Fred. Does anybody want to come in?
Can I say, I think I as an economist, I disagree. I think economics is actually key. And let me tell you why I think is key, because actually policies that encourage us shifting our behavior, changing the social norms and changing social contracts are driven by economics and incentives. So one example is, for instance, increasing taxes, carbon taxes. Well, the way you do that, if you have bad policy, I mean, a good policy is to do it, but how you design that policy is also very important, because if you design that policy that is uniform, so everybody gets taxed, what you end up doing is actually the most vulnerable in your society are affected the most. So you need to think about redistribution of these tax revenues, and you need to be clever about that. And you know, in advanced economies, we think we're very clever, but if you look at France and what happened following the Macron's policies and the Yellow Vest movement, people that were hurt by that policy were people who were actually working in Paris but living outside of Paris because they couldn't afford to live in Paris. And people who weren't affected by it were people who were living in Paris and who had access to good public transportation. So I think we need to think about not just that we need to have policy, we also need to have good policy. We need to have clever policies. We need to have just policies. The other part of this discussion is I think we're looking at this from a very much of a middle income advanced economy viewpoint. If you talk to people who are earning $2 a day, they're not concerned about a sustainable way of living. They might be thinking about it, but that's not their primary motive. So, and I'm talking about majority of the people on this planet, right? And climate change is not an issue that we in the UK can solve by changing our behavior. Sure, our technological innovation and innovation elsewhere in the world will help, but I think we need to be careful in designing policies. And there might be some room for advanced economies to incentivize poorer nations, developing nations, by adapting, new technologies or changes in behavior. So, could we think about a way of redistributing income from one country which is rich to one country which is poor in order to help them with climate change solutions? So this is economics, and I think therefore you cannot say economics is, we know enough about economics. We don't need. Actually, economics is the vehicle, is the tools that we have to be able to make this social change, which I completely agree with Fred that we need to do. So, in short, we need good policies and good economic policies, and we need to think more globally, not just from a UK or EU or G7 point of view.
And can I add to that? I think that's a brilliant analysis, because sometimes I find that people pitch different kinds of social justice against one another, particularly in the climate debate, and see that sort of thinking about climate change is a kind of luxury on a sort of middle class agenda, that if you've got time for it, you can worry about that. But actually, it's a radical issue of global social justice, and the relationship between the global north and the global south is key to that. And I think it's really interesting what you say, Camille, about economics, because in some ways economics, I sort of came to realize the term gets used sometimes when people really mean politics, and it's a way of sort of seeming to neutralize something that actually has a massive, it's like the scaffolding, the invisible, it's the air that we breathe, the sort of parameters within which we make certain kinds of decisions. And that and in our research, one of the things that's been frustrating is the idea that there's a kind of, that there's still this sort of notion of a particular kind of progress, which is that you go forward into technology and speed or back to the land. And that feels to me like a binary that's kind of not workable. I mean, it's clear, as I understand it, and from everything you're saying, Fred, that technology is absolutely critical to this future. But what's also critical about that technology is that it's shared and that it's adaptable to different environments, that it's neither one size fits all, nor is it patented in a way that means, this sort of whole world of how technology intersects with the particular form of capitalism we've got at the moment seems to me to be the issue that is holding us back, that it's actually stifling innovation. Because if some of these technologies were made available to be adapted to specific circumstances, you could move very, very fast in a way that is more difficult at the moment. So yeah, just wanted to sort of come on back on that. There's sort of not there isn't a winner in this scenario. There is something that's much more distributed than that, I think.
I think we've got to be slightly careful. A couple of points. I do become frustrated that the language of economics is confused with the language of policy, and that's not the problem of economists. That's the problem of policymakers. that they become dominated by a single language. I think it's massively positive that in the last 4 decades, we've lifted billions out of extreme poverty. But we've also given them aspirations to have a US lifestyle rather than to invent their own. And that's where I think they've got to go to Zoe's, write your own future. But what I'd like to come back to on that particular issue and from my own work is that working with business consistently, it's really easy to blame the consumer. And governments take the same point up. If you ask for it, we will build it. But consumers cannot ask for things that they don't realize could exist. So in 2003, Britain had 93 mile per gallon cars available that were profitable in 2003. When those went off the market, only 2,500 were sold, built by Volkswagen. When those went off the market, we have still not attained that number. Customers are not asking for 100 mile per gallon cars. If they did, the industry would build them. So I get very frustrated when we blame consumers because we have lots of technology, but that consumer pull is somehow not happening. So I'm going to put that frustration out there and see how you respond. Zoe, how would you get people saying, I want a 100 mile per gallon car? Because at the moment, I'm guessing that they think it's impossible. And I know it's not. I'm an engineer.
I think it's a myth that the consumer market's driven by consumer desire. So we did a project called World Factory, which explored the fast fashion system, and the sort of the extreme wastage in that system is driven by a kind of a restructuring of the whole market such that people go shopping more often, they buy cheaper clothes but overall spend more, and there's a massive environmental and human rights impact of that system. It's easy to say it's because consumers want it, they want cheap clothing, they want choice. One of the issues around that choice is that those clothes fall apart very quickly, so you cannot choose now to buy a long-lasting piece of clothing. A lot of the factories, you think, oh, I'll pay more money for this piece of clothing from a more established brand, but quite often those clothes are now made in the same factories, they just have better marketing departments. So actually there's a kind of mythology of consumer choice that's actually driven by trying to organize consumers to behave in ways that are going to make the most money. We're these sort of data avatars, right? It's been written about a lot in terms of how Facebook and other advertising companies function. And so we're always working within the parameters of what's made available to us. As you say, it's not that I'm not saying we're sort of lemmings without any agency, but there is always a conversation between our own desires and the structures in which we find ourselves. And so it's not just about awareness, it also is, I think, has been said, about social norms.
So as a child of the 60s, I wanted a jetpack, right? How do we get the children now to aspire to the 100 mile per gallon cars? Because if they asked, we would build them, because as both Fred and Camilla have pointed out, people would like to make money by servicing such a demand. Right.
Yeah, it's a complex relationship, isn't it, between consumers and people who produce stuff. But I mean, I'm sometimes impressed, again, if I can put my slightly optimistic hat on, about that consumers can have power. I mean, I've done quite a lot of work recently on deforestation and efforts to stop that. But I'm quite impressed with the power of consumers, often through NGO groups and pressure groups of one sort or another. For instance, to push back against deforestation to produce palm oil, which turns up in so many products on our supermarket shelves. And you reach the point that each individual is not making a consumer choice, but retailers, for instance, are fearful of damage to their reputation. And are starting to be quite picky about who they buy their products from. So in the corporate world, reputational risk is especially for consumer-facing companies, is quite serious. So you can imagine car manufacturers could reach a point where they did not see commercial advantage in promoting lots of gas-guzzling SUVs, but actually saw advantage in promoting electric cars and low fuel use cars and so on. You can see how those things, they're not quite happening yet, but you can see how they could happen. So, you know, I think it's important not to think of ourselves as consumers as necessarily passive, or consumers as a group as necessarily passive. They can have agency. And it's for, I guess, sort of the media people like me to promote it some more. But I think perhaps for all of us in our daily lives to kind of be the vanguardists that most people won't be.
We do observe this also in terms of investors or shareholders, consumers who are demanding firms to, adopt environmental and social and governance structures which are in line with, the things we're talking about. And to some extent, we've seen that, and we've seen pressures on. If you take the most extreme case, I suppose, is the oil and gas sector, where there has been pressure, and actually following COVID in particular, a large pressure on these companies to try to adopt practices which are more sustainable. I mean, anything they do will become more sustainable. But so I think there is pressure there, and we've seen the banking sector respond to that by creating indices which are with high ESG score firms. Some of it is greenwashing, and there's no doubt. Some of it, firms are saying they're going to do X, Y, and Z. It's greenwashing, but some of it is genuine. I think where firms are realizing that the future generation. You say our students, Steve. Our students are demanding it, and they're demanding it by going to the board meeting, shareholder meetings, and demanding the board to do something. Now, that's incremental. That's not going to lead to the big technological innovations you're suggesting, but at least something is happening. So consumers, I think, are having an impact. And it's difficult for consumers, right? If your policymaker, if your president or your prime minister stands up there and says, I'm going to build more pipelines, and what are you talking about? We're going to lose so much jobs if we have a green recovery. And I think Senator Cruz yesterday tweeted, Paris, we're going. US is going into the Paris Agreement. This is helping people in Europe. The sort of understanding of what it means. Climate change is an issue for all of us. It's not, the Paris Agreement has nothing to do with France. It's got to do with our as a global initiative to reduce emissions. So I think when you have policymakers and you have people who are in power who are projecting this voice that actually fossil fuels are absolutely fine, there is no problem, climate change is not really an issue, it also is confusing, right, for a lot of people. So consumers are trying to do something, but there are consumers who don't understand actually what the implications are, and they are sort of told by the policymakers, actually don't worry about it. Now, this doesn't happen, thankfully, in most countries.
So, Rob, I'm going to pull you in here, because what I'm hearing is a set of forces. You can see that some consumers are asking for this, but maybe they're not informed enough to ask for the right things. That some investors are asking for this, some CEOs are asking for this and heading in that direction. So how do we use science and evidence to better coordinate amongst those groups? Because my feeling is if they all sat together, they'd realize that maybe we can do something special.
Yes, it's a sort of dance, isn't it? And it with so many different sort of partners. I do think it's possible. It's possible that, for various reasons, including the climate crisis, including the pandemic, including the awareness and the growing starkness of inequalities that seem to be almost sort of inherently generated by the way the world's organized at the moment. It is possible that there's an opportunity for a kind of shifting the frame, a shifting the kind of the overarching kind of philosophy of government, of public action, public policy. I mean, and if that's true, then I think the universities will clearly have to be part of the solution in terms of coming up with new ways of thinking about how we organize ourselves and what we're trying to achieve. And I think that you know, I think these are some very open questions. And one thing I would sort of turn the question back, because we've got, you know, as you know, the range of people on this panel, is if we assume that, you know, we're already, you know, climate change is already, as people sometimes say, baked in, that even if the best ambitions and aspirations are achieved over the next few decades, we will still see greater volatility in climate and in weather. How do we think then about sort of predictability, and is tipping points things to be avoided, or are they really things to be assumed? And therefore, how you know, what are we sort of trying to achieve collectively? And I'm partly, this question is put into my mind from Zoe's card about, you know, the epic versus the tragic. But I'd be interested to hear how, you know, an engineer and an economist and a sort of writer and engager on these kind of questions, how do we think about the kind of the epic that we're embarking on, where we really just, it's impossible to know exactly what the future is going to hold, and what kind of what a stable situation is going to look like in even just a couple of decades from now.
Well, you've pointed to a new language. We're moving away from mitigation and adaptation to epic and tragic. I think that's much more fun. I'm going to make a brief point and allow you to think whether you would like to make any final points yourself as we draw close. I could really talk about this forever. I'm going to take a reasonably recent personal experience. CEO of a cement company badgered me. I'd never met them before. Said, we must meet. I made it as awkward as possible. You've got to be in my office at 8 o'clock Monday morning. They came. And at the end of it, I asked, why are we having this meeting? And they said, I was driving my daughter to school and she said, Mum, what are you doing about climate change? So roll forward 6 months. We've done some work in their factory. We've saved them energy. Their profit has gone up. And she can happily talk to her daughter in the back of the car. And they're on a pathway that is a new and different pathway. I think there are forces at play here that are potentially powerful. And my message is about play here. That interplay between that young person and their mother was incredibly important in changing the direction of a business, and a direction that business now recognizes as very positive. So let's call upon the group to offer any final remarks, if we can start in the order that we went with you, Fred.
Steve, just to add to what you were saying, I quite often speak to CEOs and other people who tell me that one of the important reasons why they want more green, or more apparently green, sometimes there is greenwash in this, policies and corporate approaches, is because when they're recruiting, when they're trying to find the smart young executives for the future of their companies, and perhaps this at a university setting, it's important to say this, they have to have the right image, because people don't want to go into companies where if somebody asks them at a party, where do you work, they tell them and everybody says, you really work for them. They want to feel good about their work. That's a really important driver. If you're a CEO looking to the future of your company and you want bright young executives coming out of universities to come and work for you, you've got to have a decent image for your company. And these days, increasingly, that means in some general sense, a green image. I think that's important, just the same as your CEO's daughter.
We have plenty of evidence for that one, Fred, but I'll take that up on another day. Kaya.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. I think what Fred just saying as well, that they're being pushed because they have to in order to get the brights and the best to come and work for them, or they have to change their agenda. But I think also firms, as you said, Steve, are realizing that a green solution or a greener solution can actually be a profitable solution. So, and when they start realizing that, the shift, I think, will become much quicker. The problem is, as humans, we are quite sticky in that sense that we kind of it's like we've done it this way. This is the way it has to be done. But I think slowly people are changing, and it's being pushed by the young people and our students, for instance, here at Cambridge, and students elsewhere, and even younger students are pushing for this agenda. So I completely agree. I also want to say I'm optimistic. I think COVID has actually opened up our eyes. The COVID shock has opened up most people who didn't think of climate shocks or big shocks as a threat to their ways of living. And actually opened up our eyes to the problems that a climate shock might create for us. You know, people are not happy being in lockdown, right? And not just in terms of restricting our social interactions, but also people's livelihoods. You know, if we cannot go out and work, and when our economies are heavily dependent on the service sector, if we cannot have social interactions in a workplace, it's going to be very difficult to earn a living. So we have to think about changing that. But I think what that has done is given the policymakers and individuals, consumers and investors, an incentive to think about how can we think about green solutions? How can we have truly have a green recovery? I don't think people are investing in that yet. But I'm hopeful that in the next year or so, and in particular with the Biden-Harris administration, where they really are talking about a recovery plan, not just a rescue plan, but a recovery plan, which will be green. So I'm started off being very negative that this is very costly, but I think things that have happened in the last year or so hopefully will lead to positive outcomes in terms of climate change and sustainability.
Thank you for being positive. And again, I can offer evidence. When COVID started, I was really worried that people would businesses would put COVID first. Climate change and sustainability would be pushed down the agenda. And really what's happened is that people have recognized the relationship between concepts of shocks, of resilience and sustainability. And it's gone up the agenda, which is fantastic news. We don't yet know quite how much it's accelerated because we're not back to a fully functioning industrial system yet. So let's hope. Right, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a fantastic conversation and kind of illustrates that the stakes are clearly very high. And, there are urgent questions that need to be addressed and progress needs to be made. It's actually also a wonderful time for universities. I think it's a really good time for universities partly because we're being pressured from the outside, from students, to think differently and to address different problems. And that's kind of forcing a different kind of organization of thinking within universities, a more interdisciplinary approach to some of these questions. And to be, let's look at Cambridge and Cambridge Zero. I mean, this is partly a result of pressure on the university from students and from wider society. So the university is having to be open and listening and responding, and then thinking about how do we then understand and make progress on something like, farming in Cambridgeshire, which clearly has some climate change dimensions because of the peat soils. It has, questions about employment and jobs. It has questions about air pollution and food security, multi-dimensional questions that really do need social scientists, humanities scholars. They need engineers and scientists. So thinking about the questions that we ask, how we come together, it's clearly tough, but quite exciting.
Certainly that's true for many of us. We like these types of challenge, working with other disciplines. I'm not sure I'm ready yet to work with Zoe.
Well, I'm really heartened by the extent to which there has been these conversations about sort of the multi-dimensionality of it and holistic approaches, because I was thinking through that earlier part of the discussion around consumerism, is that of course we're not just consumers, we're citizens. And then the story about the factory, we're family members, intergenerationally, we're lovers, we have reputations, or believe we do. There are hundreds of different ways in which we understand ourselves to be in the world, and all those different ways of being, those roles that we play, have different kinds of power and agency in them. And what we found over time is, as we tell stories about those other ways of being in the world, actually sort of the self-representation as a consumer starts to fall away very quickly. If you're busy fetching waste food to make a cook-up for your neighbours on a high-rise with amazing views and farming your sort of urban orchard that's up high, and then you're about to go to a party in a reclaimed space later, and you're buying some oysters that have just been sourced from the River Thames because it's clean enough to to produce oysters again, then you might be living kind of in a way that might be considered to be somewhat extra economic at the moment, but very locally, very interconnectedly. You're having a great time. You're so busy, you haven't got time to stand in a queue and put a mask on and go and enter a chain store to buy the same thing as everybody else, because actually fashion's all about swapping and having the newest thing is the thing that's new to you, that you have wear with pizzazz. And I guess that's where this time is, strange as it is to some degree heartening, because I think there's been an argument as though life was like even previously it seemed to me that this wasn't the case, but the argument around change was that life is stable and that these changes will disrupt that stability that need to be made. But actually for many people life hasn't been stable for quite some time. The COVID shock obviously has radically opened up that space, and that now there's the opportunity to work out how we want to live our lives in ways that are more pleasurable to us. So what we've found in conversations with so many different kinds of people from different backgrounds, who are from a university perspective, but also many people who are not involved in universities or research, is that, and from very different political perspectives as well, is that often what things come back to is relationships, community, feeling like you're living well. This feeling of doing kind of accidental damage all the time is not good for our well-being ultimately. So I think that multiplicitous approach and the idea we're not consumers, and I've got a final postcard, which is you only live once, which is usually used to book that holiday to Barbados. But I would say that this is our opportunity now to just enjoy ourselves more in a way that isn't going to make our planet fall apart.
Well, we do only live once. Through my own working life, at least, I felt enormously guilty because I'm constantly reading about this race with this tipping point. But this has been a fantastically positive conversation between us, and I'm going to take that. And by the way, I'm now going to delete the poster on my wall that says, "Be the change you want to be." I'm not the only one with that one in my world. I'm going to change it to play, and I'm going to add write the future, because I think that's more proactive and actually maybe more useful. Thank you all for contributing so wonderfully. Let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.